Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's begin today's session of comprehensive news analysis with this first article that talks about the recently held US India Trade Policy Forum discussion. In this forum, US was represented by Catherine Tia, while India was represented by our Union Minister of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Piyush Goyal. In this forum, the two sides talked about having increased access to each other's market and ensuring that the trade numbers between the two countries improve as compared to the past few years while they have become more stagnant. The two sides agreed that India would be given an improved access to the US market for selling its products such as mangoes, grapes, pomegranate, etc., while India would similarly allow access to American products such as cherries, pork, and pork related products from the US. Most experts agree to the fact that despite having good relations between the two sides, we have not been able to utilize them and convert them into great trade relations. Yes, US is one of the largest trade partners of India and India has a trade surplus with the US, but the potential that we have with the US has still not been realized. For example, when Barack Obama was the president, the two sides agreed that we will try to take our trade to about $500 billion. At that time, Joe Biden was the vice president of the US. Now, Joe Biden has become the president, and we are nowhere near this aim of $500 billion. We are still somewhere in the vicinity of $100 billion only, which has become stagnated. The article also says that in the past few years, there have been a few setbacks in the trade relations between the two nations. For example, the US decided to withdraw this GSP system under which India was covered. Not just this, two well known American brands such as Ford Motors recently and Harley Davidson earlier have decided to leave India, which does not augur well for the trade relations between the two nations. In this forum, the US representative said that they would be happy to relook into the GSP issue and they would think about including India once again into the GSP system, provided that India should also make efforts to provide more access to the American products in its own market. Apart from this, as you would know, India is regarded as a pharma factory of the world. We are the world's largest manufacturers of generic medicines, which are extremely cheap. Thus, India's pharma sector for many years has been trying to get increased access to the US and the European markets, which has been denied using a lot of domestic laws. The US representative said that we would expedite the process of giving licenses to Indian pharma companies and Indian generic drug supply will be increased in the US to improve trade between the two nations. You would remember that when the COVID vaccine was first invented, India proposed that there should not be any patent on the COVID vaccine so that the developing nations can also produce it at a cheaper cost and it can be made available throughout the world. US on the other hand was not in favor of removing patents on the vaccine because the US wanted the scientists and the companies behind the vaccine to make profit on it. This issue was also discussed and will be taken up further in the upcoming WTO summit. While this is what this article tells us, it is also important for us to revise once again what exactly is the concept of GSP, what is the present status of India US trade relations, and are we any closer to signing a free trade agreement with the US as was being discussed when Donald Trump visited India? Now, this article is based on the recent meeting of Trade Policy Forum. This Trade Policy Forum program between the two countries was launched in 2005 when India was led by Dr. Manmohan Singh, while the US had George Bush Jr. as the president. As I said earlier, the two countries had earlier decided to work towards attaining $500 billion mark in the bilateral trade, which was set during Barack Obama's regime. But that goal is still extremely far away. In fact, as per the official data, in the year 2020, the bilateral trade between the two sides was not even $80 billion. There are reports which say that in 2021, it is expected to go over $100 billion, which is a slightly positive sign. The GSP from which India has been excluded by the US, stands for Generalized System of Preferences. It is a policy decision taken by developed nations under which they give a preferential treatment to products coming from developing nations by putting lower taxes on that. This idea was started by the UN in 1971, and there are 13 nations in total that follow this system and provide preferential treatment to some developing nations. These 13 nations include Australia, Belarus, Canada, European Union, Iceland, Japan, Kazakhstan, New Zealand, Norway, Russia, Switzerland, Turkey, and the US. Where Donald Trump was the US president, he announced that from now onwards, India would not be considered under this particular policy because India is not as poor as it sounds. Secondly, India is also not providing open access to American products and has imposed high taxes on American products such as Harley Davidson superbikes. Another interesting point to look here is that India has not been able to sign free trade agreements with most of our large partners, be it the American government or the European Union. We have failed to sign free trade agreements. Even when we were a part of discussion of the RCEP, in the end we decided to stay away from it. Thus, it is important to understand why is it that India is shy of signing the free trade agreements. Right now, India has free trade agreements with nations such as Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Thailand, Bhutan, Nepal, South Korea, Malaysia, and Japan. But if you actually see, most of our large trading partners such as China, US, UAE, or the European Union are all out of this particular list. Now, there are multiple reasons why Indian government has not been able to sign more free trade agreements. For example, number one, India's approach focuses on the concept of positive list rather than negative list. Let me explain what this is. Let's assume that India and the US are signing a free trade agreement. Now, free trade agreement does not mean that there will be zero taxes on everything coming from your country. It means that we will reduce the taxes from the normal level and we will try to bring it down as much as possible. Now, let's say India and US are negotiating this deal and India gives a positive list to the US. Positive list means list of those products on which we will reduce the taxes from the US. This list can have 10 products, 20 products, or 30 products, which means that when India signs a free trade agreement, we only want very few things to be included in that. Rather than that, India should go for a negative list. Negative list means list of those products on which we will not reduce taxes. Apart from that, on everything else, we want it to be included in the free trade agreement so that there are only a few things which are kept out of this agreement, and apart from that, most of the other things are a part of this agreement. This would allow a much greater scope for such agreements. But India's approach has been following a positive list as our default setting and including very few things. Secondly, India has always been afraid of two things. Number one, we think that our agricultural sector and our small industries would not be able to sustain competition from the international market. So, if we sign a free trade agreement with the US and the US starts importing wheat and rice and other agricultural products in India without any taxes, Indian people would only buy the American products and the products made by our farmers will not be bought by anyone because their quality would not be comparable. This would harm the small industries and the farmers mainly who won't be able to compete. The next problem that India has that forced India not to sign the RCEP with ASEAN and other nations such as China is that India believes the agreement can be misused. For example, if India wants to sign a free trade agreement called RCEP, which has ASEAN nations, China, and other nations also. Now, the Indian government fears that we have not signed a free trade agreement with China because we don't want China to start sending cheap things into India without any taxes. So, we fear that China will send their products to, let's say, Vietnam without any taxes because it is an ASEAN country and covered under free trade agreement. from Vietnam, then that product will come to India without any taxes. So China would be able to send its products to India extremely cheaply without any taxes by misusing this agreement. And that is why we did not sign the RCEP, because again we are scared that our small farmers and industry won't be able to compete with the cheap Chinese products. Thus, India has been extremely shy of signing free trade agreements with most of the nations. The next article that we have focuses on the government's initiative under the Char Dham Road project, as a part of which the government is planning to widen 900 kilometers of hill roads, which will provide a much better access to four major shrines of Hinduism, that is Yamunotri, Gangotri, Kedarnath, and Badrinath. The authors here are trying to argue against this decision and are trying to make a point that interference with the environment, especially in fragile ecosystems such as Himalayas, can be extremely dangerous, as we have seen in the past. The number of landslides are on an increase in states such as Uttarakhand, and such a project by the Indian government would only make the situation even more dangerous. This Char Dham Road project was initiated in the year 2016 and had to be executed by the Ministry of Road Transport and Highways. Now, when this project started, the people living in the nearby areas, with the help of civil society, approached the Supreme Court trying to stop the project. They argued that it would harm their environment. Rather than having broad roads, what they want is a narrow road and a walking footpath so that they can go to their local market and have a good life. The residents of that area argued that we have seen a lot of massive landslides in our region in the past few years, specifically because of the increasing number of construction projects undertaken in the Himalayas. Now, when this matter went to the Supreme Court in 2018, there was a twist. The twist was this project first started as a project to increase the accessibility to these religious shrines and to make it easier for the pilgrims to visit these areas. However, in 2018, the Ministry of Defense also stepped up and they argued in the Supreme Court that we want these roads to be wider because the situation with China is as such that we need our army to go through these roads in large numbers, and thus, to fulfill the needs of the army, the roads need to be much wider. The Supreme Court, not agreeing to that argument, said that the maximum carriageway width of the road can only be 5.5 meter. Now, what is a carriageway width? If this is a road, on the side of the road there may be a pavement here and a pavement here. So, carriageway means the width of the road through which a vehicle can go without any obstruction. The entire width of the road will be from end to end, while the carriageway width will be the width on which the vehicle can travel. So Supreme Court said that the carriageway width can only be up to 5.5 meters, while the Ministry of Defense said that we have much heavier vehicles that we need for transporting our soldiers and our weapons, and we want the width to be at least 7 meter if not more to meet the requirements of the Indian Army. There are many people who argue that if the same construction has been done in Leh Ladakh, then why is it a problem over here? The authors say that the terrain of Himalayas in Uttarakhand and in Ladakh are very different. The valleys in Uttarakhand are much narrow and have a steep slope of 70 degrees, while in Ladakh the slope would have an elevation of 30 degrees. So for example, if you are going in Uttarakhand, this is how the valley will be. So if this is a road, this will be the valley, very, very steep. In Ladakh, if this is a road, the valley will be something like this. So obviously, the steeper the valley, the more dangerous it would be, leading to many more landslides as compared to the ones that might happen in Ladakh. Secondly, the authors argue that this project was undertaken even without doing an environment impact assessment, which requires the government to see the environmental cost of a project before building it. So, when the Supreme Court gave their order that the maximum width can only be 5.5 meter, It was brought to the notice of the court that the government, even before the court order, had started building a much wider road. Thus, the Supreme Court became extremely angry as to why did the government not wait for the order and why are they building such a road. The government said that the national security of the country can't be postponed and we are building a double lane road, that is two lanes, one for going up and one for coming down, which would need a much wider road, and the government said that 5.5 meters just is not enough. Thus, this matter still remains to be stuck between the Supreme Court asking why its judgment is not being followed by the government and the government saying that national security should not be compromised at any cost. The authors here, as you can imagine, are taking the side of the Supreme Court and they want the local residents of the area to be heard since their life is much more dependent on the activities going on in that area. The authors say that while building infrastructure in such ecosystems which are fragile, we have to ensure that we don't build double lane roads and give proper consideration to the environment if we don't have to face the consequences later on. This also gives us a chance to look deeper into the concept of environment impact assessment, that is EIA, which has been a buzzword not just in India but in many countries across the world. As you would imagine by now, it is a process of evaluating what would be the environmental impact and cost of a certain project. For example, if the government is building a dam to make more electricity, they would have to cut a lot of trees, they would have to displace people. So, is such a project worth it or not? This will be assessed by Environment Impact Assessment, that is EIA. This concept first started in the US in 1969 when the US came up with its first National Environment Policy Act. Other developed nations in Europe followed suit. Very soon in 1970s, developing nations such as Colombia and Philippines also adopted such a policy, which is now practiced by over 100 nations across the world, including India. In 1989, it was adopted by the World Bank as well. So now, when a government goes to the World Bank asking for a loan for any infrastructure project, they first do environment impact assessment for that project, only then they allow the loan to be disbursed. In India, the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is responsible for ensuring that EIA is done on the projects which are covered under the law. The Environment Protection Act empowers the central government to take measures to ensure that environment is not harmed with any infrastructure projects that are taken up across the country. There are 32 category of projects which if undertaken first require an EIA to be done before the construction begins. The EIA rules were notified in the year 2006 which say that there are two categories of projects, Project A and Project B. Project A are those category projects which require permission from the central government level, while Project B are those which require permission from the state government level. Moving on to the next article, which is based on the recent election of India's candidate Professor Bimal Patel to United Nations International Law Commission. The UN International Law Commission is an authority which is given the task of codifying international laws so that countries can adopt them and the International Court of Justice can also learn from such laws while giving their judgment. The reason why the author has written this article is not because it is breaking news. The author here argues that the candidate that India has sent to the International Law Commission this time, Bimal Patel, is an exception in the sense that this nomination is of a professor of international law, means for a change, India has nominated a person who is an expert in that field to represent India in the international body. Usually, in the past, whenever India has to nominate someone in the international body, we don't really look at the qualifications of the person or whether the person is an expert in that field or not. The people are usually chosen randomly by the government without any discussion with experts on that field. The author here gives a lot of examples. For instance, India has sent multiple nominees to the ILC till date. However, before Bimal Patel, the only nomination from India's side who was actually an expert on international law was Radha Binod Pal in 1958. And it is not just restricted to these bodies. The author says that even in the International Court of Justice, where India has sent judges such as Nagendra Singh, B.N. Rao, R.S. Pathak, and even the current ICJ judge Dalveer Bhandari, these are not experts of international law. Yes, Dalveer Bhandari was an Indian Supreme Court judge, but Indian laws and international laws are very different from each other. Earlier, Nagendra Singh, B.N. Rao, the people who were sent by India as judges in the International Court of Justice, were not even judges. They were members of the Indian civil services. So they were more like IAS officers, but they were sent there just because the government trusted them more than any other expert. This practice, as per the author, needs to change. The reason why this article has come up is because Australia recently nominated Hilary Charlesworth to the International Court of Justice. Hilary Charlesworth is regarded as the biggest name in international law right now, whose work is followed throughout the world, especially in terms of feminist approach. This example should be followed not just by India but other countries around the world as well, who do not attach a lot of importance to the nominations in the UN bodies. The author suggests that there should be a committee to select qualified candidates based on their expertise, and only then they should be nominated, which would only increase India's stature in the global bodies. Now, there are a couple of very interesting names here. Let me tell you two very interesting facts about the people mentioned here. First, Dalveer Bhandari. Dalveer Bhandari has been a judge in the International Court of Justice since 2012. He replaced a judge from Jordan who had been elected as the Prime Minister of Jordan, so had to resign here. So in 2017, Dalveer Bhandari's tenure was over. When the re-election was happening, he was contesting against a British judge. Now, in ICJ, although there is no written rule, but there is a convention that of the 15 judges in the ICJ, there will always be at least one judge from the P5 nations. That is, the five permanent members of the Security Council: US, UK, France, Russia, China will always have at least one judge in the ICJ. It is just a convention. In 2017, Dalveer Bhandari, after multiple rounds of voting, won the election and defeated the British judge. That became the first time ever that UK or any other permanent member of Security Council did not have a judge in the International Court of Justice. Let me tell you one more interesting incident about Radha Binod Pal. So after the World War II ended, the nations that won the war wanted to punish the other nations, including Germany, Japan, etc. For Japan specifically, an international trial was set up called the Tokyo Trials. In the Tokyo Trials, judges from 11 nations sat together to decide whether people from Japan should be held responsible for taking part in the Second World War or not. Radha Binod Pal was one of these 11 judges. Most of these judges belonged to the Western nations. They were allies of the US. So most of them thought that Japanese should be punished. Radha Binod Pal was the first judge in that entire jury to stand up in favor of Japan and said, no, the Japanese should not be punished. We are punishing them for laws which were not in existence at the time of the Second World War. In fact, after his argument, judges from Netherlands and France also sided with him and said that yes, Japanese should not be punished for these crimes. Although the other 8 judges wanted to punish the Japanese leaders, so by a majority judgment, Japanese leaders were punished, but it laid the foundation of great India-Japan relationships. In fact, even today, there are multiple statues of Radha Binod Pal that are seen in Japan. Whenever any big Indian leader addresses a Japanese leader or goes to Japan, they always make a mention of Radha Binod Pal. The Japanese also have given multiple honors to Radha Binod Pal for siding with them during the Tokyo trials. Now, looking beyond the write up, it is also important to get some details about the UN International Law Commission because this is not a body that we hear about a lot. The International Law Commission, as I said, is responsible for codifying international law. It has 34 individuals as members who are nominated by their member nations who should be experts in international law. They are elected for a tenure of 5 years. The body came up in 1947 and since then has played a key role in finalizing the content of many UN conventions, such as the Vienna Convention on Law of the Treaties and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as well. The next article from today's newspaper is about the government's vehicle scrapping policy. The Union Minister for Road Transport, Sri Nitin Gadkari, said that the government is contemplating giving more concession to people who buy new vehicles after scrapping the old ones. He said that this policy might increase the sales of vehicle by 12 to 13% and would lead to an increased GST. The government is still in the discussion stage to include these incentives in the national automobile scrappage policy. It is also important to revise what the national automobile scrappage policy was. This policy came up in March 2021 specifically for old vehicles, private vehicles which are at least 20 years old and commercial vehicles which are at least 15 years old will be covered under this policy. So if you have a private vehicle that is 20 years old, the registration of the vehicle will get expired. If you want to use the vehicle after 20 years also, you have to visit an automated fitness center of the government. They will check the condition of your vehicle, not just the age. It's not like every 20-year-old vehicle will be scrapped. They will check the emission test, so how much pollution is it making, the braking system, the safety components, and if they think that the vehicle is in a good working condition, you can still run the vehicle after 20 years, but you have to register it again and it will come at an increased cost so that people are encouraged to scrap the old vehicles. The people who scrap the old vehicles are also being given incentives by the government. The government is saying that when you scrap your vehicle, the road tax that you paid, so when you buy a car or you buy a bike, apart from paying the ex showroom price which goes to the company, you also have to pay road tax. The government is suggesting that when you scrap the vehicle, the government will return up to 25% of the road tax that you had paid and 15% in case of commercial vehicles. Not just this, if you buy a new vehicle after scrapping the old one, the government is suggesting the vehicle manufacturers to give a 5% discount to these people as well. Now, this policy can be helpful for the government also. India last year had to import 23,000 crore rupees of scrap steel. This import can be cut down if we have this scrappage policy in place. Not just this, because new fitness centers will have to be set up by the government, it will give employment to up to 35,000 people and it will lead to more investment in the industry of up to rupees 10,000 crores. Not just this, the older vehicles pollute the environment much more, up to 10 to 12 times as compared to the newer vehicles. So it will also help the environment. Now, with increasing population and increasing purchasing power of the people of India, the number of cars and automobiles on the streets are constantly on a rise. Just imagine many of your parents would not have had a car throughout their life, but now people in their late 20s, in their early 30s, people who are in their first jobs or in second jobs are buying cars. Thus, the size of the country, the size of the roads is not increasing, but the number of vehicles on the roads are increasing. So the government has to ensure that while buying a new vehicle, you get rid of the old one. Let me give you an example of a country that has a very interesting idea in this regard. Let's take an example of Singapore. The total size of Singapore as a country is less than half of Delhi. Singapore realized the fact that they can't have a lot of private vehicles. So, what they did was they introduced a policy under which if you have to buy a car, you don't just have to pay money to the car owner. The government of Singapore decided in 2017 that we will decide how many cars can be bought in 1 year. So, for example, if the government of Singapore decides that in this year we will only allow 5,000 new cars to be sold, so the government of Singapore auctions the right to own a car. If you want to own a car, you first have to take permission from the government and you have to auction. If you tell the government, I will give you 2 lakh rupees, please allow me to own a car. Someone else will say to the government, I will give you 5 lakh rupees, please allow me to own a car. So 5,000 people who pay the most money to the government will be allowed to own a car in that year. In effect, in Singapore, the money that you pay to own a car can be 4 to 5 times of the cost of the car. If the car is for rupees 10 lakh, you might have to end up paying 40, 50 lakhs to own a car. That is how they have restricted the number of cars in Singapore. The next article is on an interesting policy decisions by the government of US, China, Japan, India and other countries around the world. In the past few weeks, the prices of crude in the global market have been on a rise, especially because the oil producing nations led by OPEC have decided to cut down on their production so that there's a supply crunch in the market, as a result of which the prices of crude are increasing considerably. The US government thus requested countries around the world to release oil from their oil reserves so that there is an increased supply in the market. So, countries around the world, including India, maintain certain oil reserves with them for emergency situations. India has also agreed to release about 5 million barrels of oil from the 38 million barrels of crude oil reserve that we have at 3 different locations. These stocks with the Indian government will be sold to refineries of Mangalore and Hindustan Petroleum Corporation. While the other countries have taken these measures in the past, for India it is the first time ever that we are releasing some oil from our oil reserves. Now, what exactly are these petroleum reserves that we have and where exactly are they located? So, the idea of building these strategic oil reserves goes back to 1990 when, due to the Gulf War, the global oil prices increased considerably because of lack of production. Thus, India had to pay a lot more money to import oil for some weeks. Added to that, in 1991, India was undergoing its own economic crisis, which was so bad that we only had money to import petrol for 3 weeks and not more than that. Thus, in 1998, the Vajpayee government decided that India should build its own petroleum reserves so that we save some petrol, and when the global situation becomes very bad, we don't import it for some days so that the prices come down and we use petrol from our own reserves. Thus, the government decided to build 3 storage facilities, that is, at Mangalore, Vishakhapatnam, and Padur. This was a phase 1 of our strategic petroleum reserves. Of these, the location at Padur in Karnataka is the largest one. These have been built specifically in the underground rock caverns, which are considered to be the safest method of storing hydrocarbons. In fact, just earlier this year, the government decided to launch the phase 2 of our strategic petroleum reserves by building 2 more such locations where petroleum can be stored. These are at Chandikhol in Odisha and one more at Padur in Karnataka. This allows us to safeguard our forest reserves against any sudden increase in the global oil supply. These are the articles that we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number 1. Discuss the issues inhibiting the growth of trade relations between India and the US. Second, discuss the significance of environment impact assessment as a tool for balancing environmental conservation with our need for developing infrastructure. Both of these questions have to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.